final session of Dingle 2024. And I'm going to hand straight over to a very good and old friend, a good and old friend of Dingle as well, Professor Hugh Montgomery, who is going to introduce this session. And Hugh, delighted you put your Extreme Everest fleece on. Thank you.
I know, I did make an effort for you. Good.
So please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Let me just do the screen share bit because we were trying to work that out just now. Entire screen share, and with a bit of, oh my goodness, that's not what we want, is it? There we go. Hopefully you can see that. Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. Well, look, it's a real pleasure, and I'm so sorry that I can't be with you in Dingle. This must be one of the rare occasions when London is wetter than Dingle. And it's an enormous pleasure to be introducing this lecture, the Tom Crean lecture, about cold water. But I'm going to quickly give you 7 or 8 minutes about why this is about hot and cold water, and also why it's about 2 quite extraordinary people. The first of those extraordinary people is this gentleman, after whom this lecture was named, Tom Crean, this being a colorized original picture of the man himself. Pretty much every picture you seem to see of Tom Crean, he seems to be smoking a pipe. So I think that seems to be de rigueur if you were an explorer of the time. And whilst Tom didn't write, this book is pretty much everywhere around Dingle, and I strongly commend you to read it. It's an extraordinary tale of this extraordinary man. And it's a tale much like the second person, who I'll be introducing shortly, of ice. Tom was an Iceman, and he was Irish. There's his name written properly and not in English, and you'll see the dates in which he, at the age of 16, he left the family farm to enlist in the Royal Navy. And in fact, he was raised in his family farm not far. So if you look at the top right, there is Dublin. So this is the bottom half, as it were, of Ireland. And you'll see that where Tom was born and raised is a very short distance from where you are now. And indeed, he returned very much the same place to run the South Pole Inn with his wife and daughters. And that pub still exists. And I hope that some of you get the opportunity to drink there on this occasion or others. So Iceman and Irish. He was certainly involved in the ice, and quite extensively so. In 1901, he was on Scott's 1901-04 Antarctic Discovery Expedition. Content with that, he joined Scott's Terra Nova expedition in the race against Amundsen to reach the pole in 1911-1913. And then not content with that, he then joined Shackleton's Imperial Transantarctic expedition. So one of the true greats, really, and clearly with a great passion, because some of these were pretty much back to back when you look at them. The other I, apart from the ice, was the impossible. And when you look at what this man did, it really is quite extraordinary. He was of that breed of really tough people. On the Terra Nova expedition, there were multiple people on it, of course, one of whom was Edward Evans. And Evans decided that he really didn't like seal meat, and he particularly didn't like seal liver, and wouldn't eat it. And in retrospect, this was his downfall, because seal liver is pretty full of vitamin C and protected the others by eating it from scurvy, which affected Edward Evans. He got progressively anemic, which is, of course, scurvy, progressively weak. And after 600 miles of man-hauling, he was unable to continue. Evans turned around with him, and when Crean turned around with him, and as Evans got progressively weaker, Crean hauled Evans on a sledge. It became really too bad for them all, and in a blizzard, Evans ordered Crean to abandon him. But Crean refused to abandon another man on the team and walked 56 kilometres across the Ross Ice Shelf to get help, which he succeeded in doing, and Evans was rescued and survived and went on to a long life. So again, an extraordinary man of ice and impossibility. But not content with one act of heroism, he decided to have another one on Shackleton's Imperial Transantarctic expedition. And after the Endurance, of course, was trapped in ice and sank, and they were trapped for 492 days on drifting ice, Crean was one of the many who used the lifeboats to sail to Elephant Island, and then one of the 5 who took a sort of cannibalized open boat they'd essentially built and sailed it 1,500 kilometers to South Georgia to get help, which they did. And you know the story of how all of those people were indeed rescued. And just to give you some idea of the scale, because it's pretty hard, isn't it, to think of the distances covered. There's South America at the top there, and that's just the distance between South George Island and Elephant Island. It was a long, long way for the trip. And the other eye is impressive, because these feats of heroism were recognised with the Albert Medal for life-saving and then the 3 Polar Medals for which he was awarded. Now, I promised you 2 people and 1 bit about cold water, because that links our first person and your invited speaker today. Because cold water exposure for pleasure or for therapy has been around for a very, very long time. Indeed, the Edwin Smith Papyrus, named after the person who discovered it, which is 3,500 years old, describes the multiple uses of cold water for therapeutic purposes in ancient Greece. It was used to treat a large number of different conditions. 400 BC, Hippocrates was describing its medicinal and analgesic uses, and indeed, quote, saying, the water, to which he was referring to cold water, can cure everything. And as someone who's currently icing my Achilles tendon for analgesic purposes and also potentially for its therapeutic purposes, I seem to have learned from them. The Romans indeed used cold water immersion for treating all sorts of things, including fevers, including tertian fever, which we now know as malaria. Indeed, if you go to the Roman baths in Bath in Britain, you'll find a sequence of pools. The last but one was the hot bath. The last one to the north was a frigidarium, which was actually a cold pool, which was stacked with ice, kept in ice sort of pits, or shoveled snow when that were available, because it was thought that the move to the cold water had therapeutic advantage. And to bring it home to you, I did even find a reference to its use in Ireland, where cold water was used to, quote, treat the lunatics, Limerick Asylum. And unfortunately, they dumped someone into ice water in 1873 and he dropped dead. So it was in Limerick Asylum after that. The point being that cold water, though, has been used therapeutically for a very long time indeed. And it started to become fashionable. So I looked on Google Trends recently to see how fashionable. And if you put in cold water swimming into Google Trends in the United Kingdom searches, you'll see not much was going on. There was a bit of a grumble going on up till about 2016. It really took off, didn't it, in COVID, when people had a bit more time, needed isolation. And you'll see that it's had pretty much a consistent number of searches since then. If you look at the United Kingdom by sub-region, you'll see Northern Ireland. Of course, this is UK. It's not counting Southern Ireland. But Northern Ireland is way up there as the most popular. The Celts seem to be leading the charge here. Northern Ireland, Wales, Scotland, and we English laggards are way behind. But we're also a bit behind the rest of the world. Look at the world searches, because they were picking up really from around 2007-8, a gentle slow ramp up until they too got the big hit with COVID. Again, it does seem to be rather around us. If you look at the top 5, Guernsey and Jersey were the big searches over that time. But Ireland, so that's Southern Ireland, right in next, followed by us in the United Kingdom. So the UK is lagged behind, but still this is largely a Celtic endeavour. If you look at what they're looking for and its medicinal purposes, I've turned to PubMed for that. And what you'll find here is that if you put in cold water and swimming into PubMed, you find an increasingly large number of publications ramping up over recent years. And whilst in the newspapers and on television we hear that it's all about mental health, the number of publications for that is still relatively small, 6 last year and 5 this year. The purported benefits, though, are substantial. If you go through the general press, people say they feel more alive. They feel that their depression or their anxiety is improved. They claim their immune function's better. They get fewer colds. They're less sick less often. And I am prepared to believe that anecdote, but unfortunately, we really do lack the trials. So again, if you go to the trials registries for the last 10 years, in terms of randomized trials, they're pretty flaky, they're pretty narrow field, and they're not very substantial. So 2018, impact of oxycodone and cannabis smoking, which also has an element of cold exposure. I'm not sure that smoking weed and eating oxycodone and then going swimming in the cold is a particularly smart idea, but there you are. We've got the effects on performance. We've known that for a while in terms of repeated physical performance. 2022, we've got another analgesic study this year with gout. We've got multisensory stimulation, 1L, which is cold in fibromyalgia. And we've got some basic science about ketone body use and effects on TNF alpha, plus or minus cold exposure. The point being that this literature is really pretty insubstantial, and we're lacking. If you look at this one, it's published in 2013 as a reprint from 1985. We've got a lot more anecdote than that about that the hot water people can get into with cold water exposure. And you'll find lots of press reports such as this one of a woman dying in 2022, another in a Derbyshire river here in September 23. And if Mike Tipton is, and I don't know whether he is, he of course is representing many of these cases about why dumping yourself into cold water unexpectedly when you're otherwise not very fit probably isn't a terribly smart thing to be doing. But I will, as a caveat, say, of course, what we all know, that absence of evidence of benefit is not the same of evidence of absence of benefit. And I would genuinely think that if something has lasted more than 2,000 years, and in fact, as far as we know, potentially 4,000 years, across diverse cultures, to have persisted, humans must presumably have found some sort of benefit to this cold exposure. So my guess would be, were the trials to be adequately performed, that we will find benefit across a range of medical conditions. So maybe one of you will run those trials. And finally, 2 people I promised you, not 1. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce your speaker today, and she really does rank up there with Tom Crean. I think she is very, very worthy of the title that comes with this lecture, because she is an extraordinary woman, and I've followed her adventures from afar for a very long time. As someone who has non-freezing cold injury from cold water exposure, I've never managed to do what your speaker today has done. I'd like to plug her book for her because she probably did it for herself. It is a great read, along with Tom Crean's book. This is your compulsory reading for CPD from today's meeting. And just as we talked about there being an ice man in the form of Tom, Nuala Moore is the ice woman, world famous for open, indeed cold water exposure. Like Tom, she is Irish, not born in Kerry, but born in Donegal. Like Tom, she has also done the impossible. In 2006, that's 18 years ago, she was one of a 6-person relay that swam round the entire coast of Ireland, 1,300 kilometres. An extraordinary feat, because these are not easy waters, even in a sailing vessel. 2 years later, she decided a double relay crossing of the whole of the English Channel. And she also has the other eye, which is the ice exposure. In 2013, she received multiple medals in Murmansk in the World Ice Water Swimming Championships. She swam in a relay across the Bering Strait between Russia and the United States of America. The same year, she swam a kilometre at freezing point in Murmansk. 2 years later, she won the age group record for swimming a kilometre in temperatures below -5 Celsius. And that impressive character and those impressive feats have indeed also, as for Tom, been recognised. Not yet with quite enough medals, but I'm sure that they'll come. In 2011, the Margaret Smith Award for the Irish Long Distance Swimming Association. 2013, nominated as World Open Water Swimming Woman of the Year. And chosen as one of the only people of the year by the Irish adventure magazine Outsider. So a truly impressive individual. And again, let me plug her book, because she probably won't get for herself. So it's an enormous pleasure. I'm very grateful for being given the honour to be allowed to introduce Nuala. But now the stage is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Wow, thank you. Thank you very much. By my slides. Thank you very much, Hugh. That was absolutely lovely. A little embarrassing. Okay. Is that okay? Okay, perfectly. So thank you very much for the honour of presenting today, and my presentation is going to bring you through a little bit of chaos, but it's pretty much what I represent in my own life, so hopefully you can enjoy that moment. So for me, open water swimming, cold water swimming, wild swimming, ice swimming, it doesn't really matter what it is. We're swimmers and we just change environments. I've been very privileged to have grown up here since a very young child, to the age of 3, and the water outside here has been my swimming pool all of my life. But I'd like to start it off with taking you to a place of Cape Horn, which is in the southern tip of the most southerly tip of islands off the south of South America. In 2018, I took the opportunity of going to Cape Horn. The reason I went there was a personal reason, and I will get into that later on. But it's a swim in the area 56 degrees south, where there was no land east or west as the world turns, and just south of me was Elephant Island. My reason for going there, I will touch on, but when I got there, I think I hadn't really thought it through, what you decide and what you discuss in your own world, and suddenly what you're embracing when you get there is a different story. So this is the swim. And when I got there, my plan was to have a rescue unit, and they would enter the water with me. I had 2 dive medics. And when I got there, the Admiral Adante from the Chilean Navy, who is the lighthouse keeper, said that I could absolutely enter the water, but I couldn't have the rescue unit with me because the conditions were too rough. For me, I had to make a choice at that point. I could go back inside the island and I could swim lighthouse to lighthouse, or I could stay where I was, take the swim, but the boat would leave me. And at that point, I had to make a call. If I went inside the island and swam lighthouse to lighthouse, I would have the protection of the land, and that wasn't why I came. And it wasn't about the swim, it was about the reason that I chose the swim. And at that moment, I was on the small Zodiac that was tied to the rescue boat. And my medics who were with me, my dive medics, I looked up and I said, "Tell me again how you're going to get me out." And they just said, "You've got to let go." Because I knew at that point there wasn't anybody coming, there isn't any helicopter, and there are no rescue services. And as soon as I let go, I'm going to be on my own in these waters. And you can see from those waters how hard it was to see me, let alone to get to me. So my choice was at that point, do I take the easy option or do I let go? So again, taking you back to our beautiful beach, Slaughdean. And for anybody who's been here for the last few days, I hope you've taken the walk out to the castle. And on the other side of it, we were discussing last night the wonderful Fungi. He was 38 years with us. And from all of my swimming career, he was with us in the water. And it was interesting watching him age and him watching me age. As I looked at him, I wondered, did he hear my demons? And looking at him, we could see him aging. And it was a wonderful opportunity to have such, I suppose, a live movement of such a beautiful animal in and around us. And I often think what we surround ourselves with creates our possibilities. And having Fungi here for us in our swimming pool would have been amazing. In 2015, I will spin through a little touch on what Hugh mentioned. In 2006, I was part of a team to swim around Ireland. I was part of a team to swim Russia to America. I absolutely loved opportunities to swim Uruguay to Argentina, Chile to Argentina, and amazing open waters. I loved the open water. And in 2011, I got drawn to the ice, and I'll touch on that briefly. But the ice for me is where the extremes were. They keep you honest. And what I loved about the ice was the adventure, the sense of pain and being encompassed with all these things that bring you back to this moment. If you can't breathe, you can't swim. So for me, pioneering ice at a time where nobody in Ireland, in 2011, there wasn't any other person swimming distances at that temperature, but I still chose to be the maverick, and I drove into it for reasons that I'll discuss later. Because of where I live, I loved swimming. I would be dropped out there many years ago. My sister would drop me past the lighthouse, and I would just have a little tow float, and in there I would have sandwiches and a little bottle of water, and I would swim, and I would leave my clothes on the pier, and I would hope I'd make it, and if I didn't, I would have to get out here and squelch my way home in my swimming togs. And on Friday nights when my peers were in the nightclub, I was waiting for a call from psychiatric, "Are you ready to go?" As I walked through the town in my swimming togs. But it didn't bother me, because I felt, what are you going to do for 3 hours on a Friday night? I would sit on the South Shore with my sandwich and a cup of tea and watch the boats go by and then swim home. So I had that sense of adventure from a very young age. So in 2006, I was invited on to this project to swim around Ireland, and what an amazing opportunity to see the country from the outside in. I jumped at it and I said, absolutely. Like, as a swimmer, it was 830 miles as the crow flies, 4 or 5 weeks of swimming, 4 to 6 hours every day, without work stresses, without anything happening. It wasn't to be a major project for me. It was like, what an opportunity. So we trained, and as time passed in our training, like, you do take into consideration everything you can control. What you can't control are the variables that happen as we start swimming. Now, the conditions were never perfect. And as we left Donegal and you start swimming northwards, around by Carlingford Lough, Belfast Lough, and coming down, you get a lot of assistance. The honeymoon period, we had a very big team. We had 4 rescue units. We had Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, and each one of those changed on a Sunday. And teams change because they need to stay focused. The swimmer, we can keep moving, but we don't have eyes, ears, or we can't hear. So therefore, they need to stay focused. So the team was the major driver in this. And as we left Donegal and we arrived into Carlingford Lough, which is just north of Dublin, and then we headed down the south coast to Tusker Rock, we were still 2 weeks in, and we were really, really on target. At that point, back-to-back immersion started to become real. You're sitting on a Zodiac for 18 hours a day. And, simple things like going to the toilet, eating. And in particular, there were only 2 or 3 women on the project in total on the expedition. So I certainly need to have a tantrum every now and then. And having a tantrum on a 5.5 meter vessel, which you have 4 other men on, you just throw your bottle and you kick the tubing, and then they all look ahead, and then they turn back and say, "Are you done?" And then the tantrum has to be done because we have to keep moving. So, it was an amazing opportunity of patience and learning to work with units, because not every team do we assemble for ourselves. Some teams we're part of. And that was an amazing opportunity. But then as we turned Tusker Rock on the southeast of Ireland, we'd lost all assistance. And as you turn the southeast, we're now heading west. Tides run north-south. Everything is going north-south, and we're going west. So the miles that were 28-minute miles or 20-minute miles suddenly became 50-minute miles. So you're getting more tired, you're physically breaking down. Your body isn't able for these back-to-back immersions. You're 18 hours a day on ribs, and suddenly it's getting longer. Life was becoming quite difficult. And these were the things that we didn't factor in. It was interesting that Anne-Marie, the other female swimmer on the team with me, she is a nurse. So as a result, is that okay? Yeah, it is, yeah. Okay, so we used to take blood pressure, because, you start to look into why the breathing was escalating or elevating, or why you were exhausted all of the time. Like, we didn't have a doctor, we didn't have any type of assistance, we didn't have nutritionists or any of that. And for me, one of the biggest things was control. Like, I always looked to understanding 20-minute miles, 30-minute miles, adding up what I needed every day. And suddenly the miles were 50-minute miles. There wasn't any breaks. We were moving. And when all of that was building up, I knew I should have been at home. I gave up work to do this. Like, who gives up 2 months to swim around Ireland? And all of that stuff, so I can understand Base Camp Mount Everest, where you're not contactable and when you can detach from your life. So at that point, I always like to note that when a man, no doubt they're expeditionaries here, they tend to look quite, rugged and handsome and expeditionary. Females tend to look a bit psychiatric. And it's not fair. It really is not fair. Because when you spend 14 to 16 hours a day in and on the sea, the last thing you want to do is condition your hair, let alone have a hairbrush and let alone use moisturizer. So our bathtubs at night were filled with water, not to wash ourselves, but to wash out our equipment and wash out our bottles and all our stuff. So days and weeks passed and we hadn't showers, but it didn't matter because we were swimming around Ireland. So there was never a thing as a perfect condition, and it became arm over arm. That was the day we left Valentia Island to swim across Dingle Bay. And suddenly, you are waiting for that perfect day, but it never comes. And in the nicest sense of the word, we were just arms for hire. We were now just the means of moving the team along. And the day we went through Valentia, or the Blasket Sound, for anyone who has seen it, it's a really turbulent body of water. And coming up to that point, my father, who was a fisherman, he passed away a few years ago, but he was a really hardened, tough man. And I would ring at night, or he would ring at night, every night, because he knew the coast, and he would say, a man can live for days out there, don't be fretting about it. And one of his biggest lessons to me was never be weak. Don't ever be weak out there, because if you're weak, your team have a bigger problem. And by kind of complaining about things that we couldn't control, you develop this sense of responsibility to your unit. So then you just keep moving. But we also understood that once we hit the west coast, we would pick up the tides running north again. So we would get assistance, and it builds you up. So coming through the Blasket Sound, I was delighted when I heard the rescue boats coming out, because I knew they were bringing donuts from the bakery. But as you can see from the photograph, they didn't give me one. And when I got out of the water not to get my donut, I was like, that's close to a hanging offence. And they just sat there and ate the donuts in front of me, which I still don't like, that concept that they didn't share their donut. But coming into Dingle for me was one of the most amazing things, and it was coming home. And I'll never forget that feeling of recognition. And people talk about medals and they talk about honours, but it's inside. It's deep in the belly of the beast. When you raise your hands and you think, oh my God, I've made it. I'm strong enough. I held it together. I'm here. And it was beautiful to see all my friends and family on the pier, because the cost of any event is the amount of your life you've exchanged for it. And for any one of us, everything that we do, all of the stuff we take on, there's somebody behind your door. There's somebody who's watching you giving all of this up. And then to see them applauding you, then you know it was worth it. So it gives you the ability to walk on. So the West Coast for us was an unknown. We didn't know how to navigate it, and you're just not too many thousands of miles from America, so there isn't any way to ascertain as to what thousands of miles of rolling ocean will be. So what ended up being something that we believed we would get assistance with ended up being a really long, arduous journey. Now for that, we thought it would be a 28-day project, 4 weeks, 5 weeks. It ended up moving into 2 months. And when you're just somebody who gave up work and you gave up life and you gave up everything, you're also giving up the emotion of people telling you, you shouldn't be giving all this up. What have you got? And all I kept thinking is, like, if you can't breathe, you can't swim. And our teams would say, if we can't get you out of the water, you can't get into the water. So we all had these mantras of working together as a unit. But as you get really tired, for me, these are one of the more troubling of movements, is you actually turn to breathe, and sometimes there is no air. And you just take in water. And it keeps coming back to it. You've got to find your pocket of air. You've got to find a way where you can breathe. And if you can't breathe, you've got to figure out how to work through that. So we were very privileged in the Round Ireland. After 56 days, we walked on to the beach in Carrickfinn in Donegal, and we were the first team to ever circumnavigate the island by swimming. But it was a team event. And I mentioned it last night, which I think it's quite unfair, but we all gained 2 stone weight. And that's something that needs to be looked at. I do think if I ever get to stand in front of God, it'll be my first question. How do you swim for 56 days and you gain weight? But these things happen. So yeah, we were obviously, there are many reasons for it. And we didn't ever see a pizza burger or anything like that. In fact, we didn't eat much. So yeah, that's one of the things. As the years passed, I struggled with marathon swimming when that was over. As you can appreciate, we were completely broken. And for anyone who comes home from expeditions, you know, sometimes there's the vulnerability of everything you give up. You come home and you try to kind of make peace with all of the sacrifices. And you try to be normal, but normal will never be there. So for me to be normal, it meant that everyone was quite pathetic. And that didn't really work with me because, you know, I just wanted to blend in, and that was never going to be the place anymore. So I had to find out how to become, I suppose, how to see myself in other people. So I set up events for people, and I love to watch somebody swim for 400 meters or a kilometer and to see their excitement. And that then allowed me to believe how amazing I was. But it was through other people's eyes that I got to see my own sacrifices. But as the years passed, I did the double-crossing English Channel relay. And I decided then my time in marathon swimming was over for no other reason than if I wanted to swim for 6 hours, I would just get in. And I was privileged to be asked by the Irish rugby team before they went to the World Cup to come and speak to them before they went out. And one of the questions Andy Farrell asked me was, you know, how do you swim for 12 hours or 14 hours? And my answer is just don't make plans for the afternoon. Because I don't understand. Like, if it's what you need to do, you train for the challenge, you prepare for the challenge, you take it on board, you do it. You don't complain, you commit. So I had broken my relationship with pushing myself. I felt whatever it is I could do, I can do. So I needed a challenge. And then in 2011, I was invited, if you could use the word, to swim in Siberia. And I thought, absolutely, no problem. So in 2012, I had just completed the swim across Lake Zurich, which is 26 kilometers. And again, it was a 12-hour swim. I just got in the water at 7 o'clock, got out at 7 o'clock that night. Great day out. And for me, having the opportunity to go and be challenged by something, I thought, wow. I sat in the ice bath, which is the photograph that Hugh used. And I just sat into the ice, just to experience zero, to see what it would feel like, what would burn, what would move, where the panic would be, what it would experience. And in there, I needed to figure out what I would be in the ice. So when I got out to Siberia, it was minus 33-degree air. And I thought, how do I breathe? So I'd spoken to a friend of mine, he had climbed Mount Everest, and he was telling me to breathe shallow, not to take the deep breaths in, because if it's minus 33-degree air and that's going into your lungs, it's going to cool your core much quicker. So to breathe shallow, and I thought, I'm way ahead of the people here. But once I got into the water, when we got there initially, the other thing that took me by a blindside is we were hit with blood pressure monitors, ECGs. There was a full test of medicals, and we were like, we knew nothing of this. And what's interesting is there was a group of us that we were all sent off to a quiet room, that if we couldn't get our blood pressure under control, we wouldn't be allowed in. And it just shows you the seriousness of which they view it, that they wouldn't allow people to swim until they viewed them medically fit to enter the water. So obviously, thankfully, I was fit at the time and everything worked out great. But after 150 meters, the exact moment I got into the water, it was like, and for anyone who experiences cold shock now, it's a complete tightness. But when I put my face in the darkness of the lake, it was black. And what was interesting is, like, once I started to swim, even though I was rocking up and down the pool for 20 kilometers or 10 kilometers or wherever, after 150 meters, I actually thought I was going to drown. And I found that very, like, I just couldn't figure out what was happening to me, but it took my breath away. And for me at that time, you know, being in that position, it was something that I struggled with, but in a fascinating way, it stopped me. You know, it was the first time in years something stopped me. And I thought, wow. Now, I was embarrassed getting out of the water. I genuinely was. I was in this position that, you know, it was the first time in my life somebody was going to judge me for traveling 4 flights across the world and suddenly being hit with ice. And you only swim 150 meters. But I think my biggest problem really was how I viewed myself. So I thought, okay, once we got out of the water, I was perfectly fine, a bit red, a bit frozen, but perfectly fine. So I went home and I looked at that, and only 2 other women in the world at that time had actually swam. Lynn Cox and Natalia Serrera had actually swam 1,000 meters at zero, and I thought I could try it, and everyone was saying, for what? And I said, but I can, I know I can, I'm capable of it. So I went to research. I went straight to Mike Tipton. I went to all Gordon Guisbrick. I went to understand what is taking my breath away. And the more you can understand, the more you can understand how to swim. Because if you can't breathe, you can't swim, and I couldn't breathe. So I had to figure out what it was. Was it anxiety? Was it stress? Was it heart? What was stopping me? Because other people were swimming, and if they can do it, I can do it. So I trained for what stops me, and a lot of times people look at what to do in swimming or what to do in any sport. You train for what's going to stop you. And for me, it was that breathing. What do I do to breathe? So I actually started, I bought a good heart rate monitor, great blood pressure monitor, and I focused on my breathing. I went up into the Pedros Lake in the months of the winter in January, February, and I pushed really hard to understand how to do 1 minute extra each time, but I trained to recover. So I went into the water and I swam for 1 minute extra, and how I gauged that was how my blood pressure was afterwards, how my heart rate recovered, and I would sit on the rock. And if I recovered really well, it was then I moved on. So I only trained when I was recovered. And I only moved on at that point. And I thought I was brilliant. So I understood the challenge using all of the research about the swim failure, cold water incapacitation, all of the stuff that had been put into the research, and then used the medical side of it as well. Now, at this point, I was having ECGs quite frequently, as in trying to manage who I was. But I also started to understand caffeine, gels, sugar, dairy, all of the stuff, because all of it impacts who we are. So after only 8 weeks at that point, I went into Pedros Lake and I swam for 38 minutes at 3 degrees, and I thought it was brilliant until I got out of the water and I ended up in a helicopter. So what happened was, when I got out of the water, I had a team. I had 5 people, 3 Coast Guard. I was actually an ex-member of the Coast Guard. And what we hadn't factored in is once I got dressed and I went to stand up, I collapsed. But it wasn't a total collapse. It was in and out of consciousness, and I knew enough to know that you can't risk your team. So I sat down. 1 casualty was enough. So they made the call. And the thing about Dingle is, obviously, I'm going to be on the news at 6 o'clock, and I knew everything was going to be judgmentfest.com. But I'm a really good casualty. When I went to that swim that morning, I drew my veins. So I had markers here. I had my BP. I had a diaphene because I needed it. So I had everything that thankfully I'm not on any other medication, but I had my sister's phone number, and I drew it in waterproof markers on my hands. So if I couldn't speak, at least I tried. And I think all of those things are very important, because we had a plan, and people say, oh, you failed. You didn't. My safety plan worked, because that's what it's about. You train to fail. You train to bring it to that point. So it was a Sunday afternoon, and because I had done the extra work with the Coast Guard, I'd actually been in the before, but still I was slightly embarrassed that I had brought them out. But they're always good. They're delighted to sit obviously. But we didn't know that there's quite a large percentage of people, 1 in 5 with their own rescue, can actually die if it doesn't get to that. And I hadn't known that at the time, and that would have been wrong before. So I did the right thing. But it was when they spoke about post-rescue collapse, I was like, brilliant, another thing we can talk about. And actually, when you look at it now, they take people out in a seated manner or in a horizontal manner, because obviously take them out in a vertical, there is a blood drop and also other risks of hypovolemic shock. And I'm not going to talk about this to a group of medical doctors. Okay, so it's like I was presenting to Professor Tipton about 2 months ago, and I was like, you have to really tread carefully when the people you're quoting to are the people who know more. So 8 weeks later, I went to Murmansk, and I was the 3rd woman in the world and the first Irish swimmer to swim 23 minutes at 0, because I learned. And people would tell me, you don't need to do this. And I said, but I do, because I knew I could. And one of the things that I've always stood with is, you know, whether it's coming from, even though I was born Donegal, coming from Dingle or Kerry, like, we're mavericks. You know, there's a sense of owning what you want for yourself. This is what I wanted for my life. I knew I could do it. I wanted to be the first. And it's not that you want to be the first of anything, but isn't it wonderful to lead the way? So in 2013, I was part of the group who were invited to be joining the swim from Russia to America. Amazing opportunity. I never looked at anything other than what a privilege. The reason the swim, I'll run back on that. One of the reasons that the Bering Strait was probably the most dangerous relay swim in the world is just south of the Bering Strait. I turned the world on its axis there. Is you have 4,000 kilometers of rolling ocean. That ocean has to run north through the Bering Strait every day into the Arctic, and then the Arctic has to run south. It can't fit. So it eddies back and it spins, and that's why the world in that area of the deadliest catch and stuff is chaotic, because water has to move somewhere. So as it spins and eddies and it can't get through, like as swimmers, we're greatly impacted, but what you also have is this rogue waves, these waves that conflict with each other and they lift and they move. And the Bering Strait is actually only 30 meters deep. So you've got thousands of footage of water going down, miles of it, and that all has to rise up over the shelf as well as the volume. So it is quite chaotic. The reason the swim was successful is because it was a hospital ship. It was a fully functioning hospital. It had everything that you can imagine from surgeons onwards. And this hospital ship served from north of Russia down to east of Japan, that area. So it picked up troops and it catered for all of those areas there. So it's a hospital ship, the Ersk. Now, for us as swimmers, the challenges were huge, you know, but you only had 10-minute slots. But it would be trusting people we never met. It's with a language we don't know. It's understanding things that we have no idea. There were variables outside of our control. But the one commitment we made is we trusted ourselves. And Anne-Marie and I were part of the Round Ireland team together, and she's a phenomenal swimmer as well. So for us, you know, we came prepared, but we also became a unit within the unit. You know, we became a team within the team. And being Irish, the first thing we did when we got onto the ship was we secured a kettle. So I ran up to the kitchen, decided this is a hospital ship, immediately inquired that, okay, these doctors and nurses and everyone on the ship are going to be serving us our meals, and that didn't work with me, so I offered my services to work in the restaurant, because I kind of guessed if you're going to be getting your food from me every day, the hand that feeds you is quite valuable, so therefore the rescue unit might just pay a bit more attention to my face. But being Irish as well, you know, having your little cabin with your little electric kettle in it, somebody at the dark of night will knock on the door and look for a cup of tea, and it's a great way to communicate. So having the kettle and having that communication was excellent. Now, Dr. Rena and Dr. Natalia Fratinova, they were the two doctors we worked with in 2011-12 through all the ice swims. They used to travel around the different groups because they were doing a lot of research at the time. Without them, this expedition would not have been successful because they knew a lot of the swimmers, but they also, where the doctors and nurses in the hospital were functioning as doctors and nurses, these were experts in cold water. So, you know, everybody was tested in advance, but these were the conditions we were swimming in. There's like 2 boats and a swimmer in those waves. And it's really difficult when you are asked in 3-degree water to let go of your Zodiac and get into those conditions. Trust people you don't know with a team, some of them you may never have met. And there was a mixture of egos and people who wanted more. And people were there for wrong reasons, right reasons. And some people had never seen the sea. Some people live and work and operate in freezing water that are rivers and lakes confined, had never in their life experienced waves. So the mix of people. And then we have the tooted walruses. And these guys, they lived on the Dimidi Islands. Now they're 2,000 kg each, and they feed on blubber, so I was a high-risk candidate. And I thought, this is not my end. This is not how this story ends. But at the same time, you know, people talked about them. But at the end of the day, human error was always going to be our biggest problem. It was never going to be the things that they did, the whales, the orcas. It was always going to be the mistakes we made in preparation or the mistakes the team would make, or the planning, or the organization, or the presentation. So human error is always going to be the thing that'll get us into trouble. So at 3 a.m. in the morning, when you're called up, and our swim rotations were 10 minutes, there was 3 swimmers per boat, so it was a 45-minute slot. And when you get into these boats at 3 o'clock in the morning or 2 o'clock in the pitch dark of night, and you're hanging on and you're asked to let go, you're letting go into an area of trust. You have to believe that they will get you out, and you have to believe that you're strong enough to stay alive. And what I loved the most about it was the madness. And it was this sense of being driven into this moment, because this is all you've got to worry about, this exact moment, and then your teammate. And I would constantly repeat, this is why you're here. Now, when I was young, my father would say I was built for it, and I used to think, would you stop calling me fat? But he wasn't. It was the mind, that I was driven, that I was so strong of mind. So yeah, there are certain times we find ourselves where we are because of who we are. And I think we need to embrace that. But these were the conditions of the Bering, and it didn't get any better as time went on. What's fascinating is, and I think we all are aware of this, is that, you know, when things get really difficult, we do really bring out the best in ourselves and each other. And it elicits strengths in us that we never really thought we had. But that's what adversity does. And then the Bering hit us with everything it had, because we ended up at a situation where swimmers were only covering, 6 swimmers over 2 hours were swimming 150 meters. And then it was like 6 hours, 27 swimmers were covering 2 kilometers. And this sense of like, we have to quit. But like, quit why? Quit why? We were making progress. And it's about finding progress in chaos and going into chaos and figuring out, how do we move forward? And one of the things that we had learned, and we tried to speak to them about, was the west coast of Ireland. But it's also the fact that, you know, if you hold on strong enough, something around you may weaken. You know, and a lot of times in life, the variables may change. But at that moment, if you give up and it changes, we've all lost. So we did stick with it. And I remember Anne-Marie at one stage, at one meeting, said, just throw in the fast boys, because that's why they're here. But those fast boys need to rest. So we were thrown in, the big girls, because we could hold the storm as well. So it came down to a small bunch of swimmers. And this will give you an idea of what it was like.
The decision was made to continue the race without waiting for the storm to subside. A team of the fastest swimmers went to the starting point. The strongest were determined to take the strait on. "27 swimmers from the UK, America, South Africa, Estonia, Ireland, Italy, Russia, the Czech Republic, Chile and Poland took turns and clawed their way metre by metre along the distance separating the team from the Alaskan shore and victory. On that day, they got 4 kilometres closer."
You could imagine, you know, you're in the position where for the entire day you only got 4 kilometres, but we were breaking the current. And it is a tough ask to be going into those conditions. Your blood pressure's through the roof, your panic stations. And, you know, the back-to-back immersions were now building. And it was still 3 degrees or 4 degrees. So you have the accumulation of all of this. And all you have in your mind is, I've got to stay alive. And it's that sense of survival and pincer, which is so precious. And I think it was one of the things that I loved. I just said, like, who gets this privilege? Who gets to be lowered into these waters? And don't get me wrong, there were moments where I prayed, please get me out. But, you know, there were days when I stood in the queue in the bank and I said, please get me out. So, you know, there's moments where we can choose our medicine. But when we hit that last day, you know, I was just lying on the bow, because you just embrace the madness, take pictures, enjoy this moment. Who has these memories? And I said, if I get into my nursing home, please God, I'd be saying, did I not tell you now that I swam from Russia to America? So, you know, we all have to take what we want with us. And after 6 days and 6 nights of swimming, we walked on to Wales, Alaska. And it was so funny, and I don't mind as an Irish person, you'll understand and accept when I turned back and saw the Union Jack coming behind me, we sprinted. We had to carry our flags. And I used to sit out on Ventry Beach, and because you have to train with a sweeping brush, you have to hold your flag. And I did curse the Patriots because they never had to swim with their flag in the air. But then I always had my camera, and I turned back to take a picture of Anne-Marie and the tricolour reaching Alaska, and I saw Jackie, and I said, swim, please swim. So just a very quick overview, I won't take you into it, but Irina and Natalia did a very big study, and there was a lot of crazy ECGs afterwards. But if you had a very bad medical outcome after each swim, you were not allowed to swim the next swim. So before the swim and then 10 minutes after the swim. And for a lot of people who come out of the water and say, I feel fine, you may well feel fine, but your heart certainly isn't doing great. And I think it's very important because as time goes on in our lives, we have this tendency to overrule what we feel like. A lot of people saying, I'm tired because I was up all night. Well, maybe you're tired because your heart is under a little bit of pressure. And we have to start looking at that. And what I loved about the Bering and the ice is we got evidence. We got conclusions. We were given pieces of paper and we were told you can't swim because your blood pressure is too high, or you can't swim because things are not working. And then you go home and you kind of think, well, that's something to work with. Because people now go into the ice water and it's so funny because they come out and they say, oh my God, that was amazing. And I'm like, it's freezing. Like, accept it, it's actually really cold. And in there. But again, it comes back to, for me, my dreams were all my own and I embraced the madness. So I'm just going to run through this because I just wanted to put it in. So basically, there is so many beneficial things with the ice. There's so many beneficial things with cold water. But there's also a lot of risk in the cold shock, cold water incapacitation, swim failure, all of those things. There's huge risk. But again, it's like anything. You can have a gin and tonic or you can have a bottle. Everything is perfect until we start engaging with it. We choose our cocktail. And again, just very basically, we have entering the water, you have your cold shock, and I absolutely drove Mike Tipton bananas because Mike would always talk about casualties, and I would try and explain there are people putting themselves into 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 40 minutes, myself included. We need to also address what's happening in our hearts. So we looked at all of this, and I thought, okay, this is how it was broken down. The cold shock, the cold water incapacitation, which is the swim failure, the post-rescue collapse. I had experienced it all. And isn't it wonderful now to start educating? But in the cold shock, there's also the other side of it. You have the risks. And then, of course, I read the paper from Mike Tipton, Autonomic Conflict, A Different Day to Die, or Different Way to Die, and I thought, Jeannie Mackers, just when I had it all. So it is about changing the rules. I worked with standards and procedures, and in 2015 and 16, I actually wrote a little manual because I couldn't get to everybody. So I used all of the research from Gordon Geisbrick, Mike Tipton, and I applied it to swimming. And then I went on my circuits and I started going around to all and I started doing talks because you know what, it's more than understanding what it is, it's what does it mean to you as a swimmer. So when people say, do you need a medical, check with your partner. Maybe, maybe not. It's up to yourselves. My suggestion is yes. So I think a lot of times when we look at cold water incapacitation and all of the things that happen, we have to take into consideration that all of putting your body in cold water, especially with the evidence, it slows down the functions. So therefore, your hands get cold, your body gets cold, and in that, you lose your ability to do the motor functions. So in other words, when you move your hand this way at a slower rate than you move your head, at some point, your head and your arms, they don't move in unison. So if you don't have a good stroke rate, as a result of that, you're actually breathing at a different so your hands are getting colder, your head is moving at a different rate, so you eventually are breathing into the water. And that's what swim failure is about. Your inability to get out of the water, make a phone call, drive your car, get dressed, all of these things. So it's really important. But just obviously because of the room that it is, we have muscle function, brain function. But by understanding the cold water immersion's impact on the muscles, you can then say, okay, we can limit our times to this. So swims were limited to 20 minutes or 30 minutes. Or else you can also say to people, we can monitor your stroke rate. And then with the brain function, it's really important to look at the fact, okay, you might not have cognitive, and that's why we need teams. So we put teams on both sides of the pools. And in the North Channel then, I worked on all of that. So I tried to change the standards and procedures. And I worked on that for about 4 years. And then obviously you have the very basics there on the heart function and the circulatory. So we had ECGs before and after events, you know, and we did a lot of work on it. And then this is the big one from Mike Tipton, which clearly says that swimmers should not be the person to make any decisions about their outcomes because hypothermia is insidious. So people say, I'm okay. Of course they're okay, and so are functioning alcoholics. You know, you see people navigate their way out of the bar, banging both sides of the door, but, you know, evidence now shows they can't drive a car. So it is about understanding what the beast is, and hypothermia, it creeps in. I've seen people come out of the water saying, I'm absolutely perfect, and they end up in hospital. So it is important to understand all of this, and then we put standards and procedures in place to try and make the sport safe, because the integrity of the sport is very, very important. But it's important to be able to identify, and to stop a swim. That was a world record swim I stopped. And, you know, it was no problem in stopping it. But if you look at it, Henry had dropped so low in the water that he's now breathing in, and that's swim failure. And it's just important. And when swimmers come out of the water, we always assist because they can't get dressed, they can't move, they can't function. So when we talk about teams, it's very important that your team know what exactly you're doing so they can assist you. Because it is a physiological tsunami that elicits that. But then at the same time, is that? Oh yeah. Is it? No, it's not good, it's fine. But we ended up with great competitions. And we competed around the world. And it was magic, shouting and screaming at roaring people to go. And then it was great to have that experience. So I'll just shoot those through very quickly. The North Channel in 2010, only 10 people in the world had ever swam from Ireland to Scotland. I took over the secretary of it. I wanted to effect change on the standards and procedures involved. I felt you need to be able to understand cold water at that point. There was a lot of, both these people have these photographs out, and actually Atay, the Hungarian guy at the top, he's written a book about his experiences. But he had CPR administered to him just after his North Channel, and Matthias also ended up. But for me, a lot of it is this cold water incapacitation and swimming-induced pulmonary edema. So, like, don't get me wrong, the lion's mane are real. I took that photograph swimming just out here at Slowdene, and when I heard they were in the water, I was delighted to go out and take some pictures. So it is lovely to get them up close, but they're quite impressive. But then, you know, we have the media, and this is just an interesting, this is a guy from Dublin, and it says, you know, meet the man who went from open lung surgery to swimming the channel. But it's important to know why he got open lung surgery. So he had it because in 2014, he did the North Channel, and he got really slow towards the end because he had been taking in quite a lot of water. He had indicated that he had been stung a lot. I had his observer report. But I don't know if the stings result in this, or do the stings cause the incapacitation because you're feeling unwell and then you start to swim slower. But either way, the bottom line is that he ended up with a double lung scoped out his lungs. So he had clots the size of satsumas in his lungs after the swim. So, you know, rather than the reports say that the double lung transplant or whatever went to swimming a channel, it would be lovely to know that actually it was by swimming the channel that he ended up having the double lung clean out as well. So it is important to understand the risks of these swims. And then there's the bonuses with the cold shock, where Professor Malucci's after, you know, this study in the Lido in London with the contribution factors of dementia. So cold shock has great bonuses there. And, you know, it's essential that we start looking at joining all the dots, because it's great to be able to look at left-hand side, you have the risks, right-hand side, you have the benefits, and we can make those balances work. So in 2016, I'll shoot through just watching the time there. So in 2016, I needed back out because I had spent 3 and 4 years running around trying to fix all these things in the sport, and I needed back into the insanity. So I ended up back out in Krasnoyarsk. I did a kilometre in the River Yenisei from the River Yenisei originates in Mongolia and ends up in the Arctic. It was 1 degree, and I wanted to get a good swim for me. So I was the only non-Russian swimmer to attend the event. And getting into the water for me, the second picture is me getting out after 25 minutes at 1 degree. It was about control. It was not about allowing myself to collapse. It was about staying in control and regaining who I was as a person. And these, we got scans of our heart because Dr. Arena was there again, and the green just indicates that everything was normal again. So I was able to recover from the 25 minutes at 0 and 1 degree within about 45, 50 minutes. My heart had normalized again and my blood pressure. So like over the years of doing and exposing myself to it, I was able to bring myself back to quite a good state. But, everybody's different in their different ways. So again, we talked about anxiety and depression and stuff. If you look at the signs and symptoms of cold shock, they are increased breathing, increased ventilation. And if you can control that, again, they're similar to anxiety and stress as well. So a lot of times we talk about it, in the benefits. Obviously, clinical depression is different, but I do think around achievement, togetherness, team, all of that stuff, it gets great. It gets great bonuses. Now, the hypothermia, we look at it as a risk. There's people in this room would look at it as a life. They can assist in surgeries and stuff like that. So it's amazing when you look at two sides of a coin, the benefits and also the pluses. So in 2018, I'm just finishing up now, that I had spread myself way too thin. I was trying to be all things to all people. Things were coming at immense speed, and I had to look after myself. So I felt that I needed to step out of the grey because I was very much all things to all people. I was trying to sort out the ice swimming, I was trying to sort out the marathon swimming, and the one thing I had lost was myself. I looked back and I thought, where am I going to be remembered if I don't own my own history? And that was why I decided to go for the Maelstrom again, to head back into the storm. And I took on that swim in Cape Horn. It was a swim that nobody had tried. They went there on 2 occasions, and the decision was that it was too much of a risk. The swim was $18,000. So I gave up my Jeep, and I cycled for 2 years to pay my bills. And it was one of those swims that I needed to do it for me. And it wasn't about the swim, it was about the control. Because I felt I needed to let go of control to actually let myself back into chaos again. And when you look at the location, it's the Furious 50s, and what they say is that when you go down to that area, at 40 degrees south, there is no law, at 50, there is no God. And really what they mean is there's nobody coming. And I didn't read that small print. So how do you train for a mile? It was just a mile. So how do you train for a mile at 7 degrees? And again, I suppose what I had was the understanding of the Bering Strait, that you can swim for an hour or 2 hours and maybe not go anywhere. The standard was that I would go from the Pacific to the Atlantic across the meridian. That was the swim. I had to pass that meridian to get the swim. And the risk was that I could swim for an hour or 2 hours at 7 degrees and maybe not make it. So I would have to train out here for 7-degree water. And it happened to be the beast from the east. So it happened to be that winter where we had -6, 7 degrees for all of January, February, March. And it was really freezing temperatures. And I had no choice because I had committed all the money and I had committed myself to it. So I ended up trying to reheat my hands intermittently, and I ended up with all those sores. So I had open sores all over my hands, and then the salt didn't really help. So I couldn't take any medication because I didn't want to interfere with my own way of healing my body. If I took medication, a vasodilator, it might interfere with my blood pressure, might interfere with how I respond to things. So I was just covered them with Manuka honey and wrapped them in cling film and try and heal them in that way. I couldn't wear gloves because I couldn't pull the gloves off because it would pull the sores off. So I was in a bit of a bind. And then obviously I understood the whole concept of what was engaged, but I had no choice in my mind. So I went south to Cape Horn, and the weather is always very rough down there. It's hard enough to get a slot, but I saw that little window when we got there, and I thought, wow. Now, I had 2 dive medics who I met at the Ocean Extreme Medicine, and they agreed to come with me. They worked in the Antarctic, and they came up and they said they would be my crew. And I also had a boat crew. And when we were in Puerto William, this is the Yelcho, the bow of the Yelcho, which went south to pick up Shackleton and his crew, and I thought that was a really good omen. So there I was in Cape Horn, and the realization there wasn't anybody coming. I had a nurse, a defibrillator, and the decision was that they wouldn't use it because, there isn't any reason to use it because there's nowhere to bring you. And then, suddenly it became real that I'm here, and if they lose sight of me in those conditions, there isn't anybody coming and I won't make land. So letting go with that information was the hardest thing in the world. That day, I'll never forget, putting on my goggles and thinking, I have to be home for work on Monday. This is just ridiculous. But there was something inside of me at that time that I didn't know if I was as good as I thought I was. And I often wondered if I was who I thought I was. When I looked back at the photographs, you wonder, is it me? And then suddenly you realize I have to let go, because if I don't let go, I'll never know. And Chris and Catherine were on the boat and they were saying, just let go. And I uncurled my fingers. And I remember just releasing myself into that. And I started to cry. And I think you can't cry and swim. You've got to sort this out. And as I headed into the southern oceans, I just looked up at Cape Horn and I only breathed to the left. And I looked up at this huge, iconic island that for thousands of years people have feared, rounding Cape Horn. And here I was looking up at it as a swimmer. And I thought, my only job right now is to keep rotating my arms. Now, at 7 degrees, the cold water shock was coming in, but so was the anxiety, the tears, and the tantrum, and it was all coming in. And I just thought, I'm built for this. This is why we're here. Because every one of us has a need to our legacy. And I needed to know if I was as good as I thought it was. And I said, no, this is it. So I just kept breathing, and I was very lucky. So the job of the team was always going to be the hardest thing, keeping an eye on me. And I'm in those waves just rotating my arms. So they had the tough job of finding me. And one of the hardest things with the fishing boat, because it was only a small boat we had, is I knew it couldn't tick over. The engines couldn't come down too much because she wouldn't take the waves. But I also knew she had to keep steaming. So at times she was 100 meters away. And having those challenges in 7 degrees, not knowing when it would end, this was the challenge for me. So I started singing the Brendan Voyage. And I used to always go back to song, and it's around by Terra del Fuego and up the warm Gulf Stream and into Dingle for the night. So I would sing my songs, and then after over 30 minutes, the boat crossed my path, and I could hear the engines, and I looked up, and I was just in the boat. So yeah, that was it. And I arrived on to Cape Horn Island, and I left my tricolour in the lighthouse with Admiral Adante, who was observing the swim from the island. And I crossed the meridian from the Pacific to the Atlantic, and I was the first swimmer in the world to achieve it. But for me, it wasn't about the swim. It was about finding out what power was. Because who are we at the end of the day if we haven't got that ability to believe? And it was trusting myself. And, you know, when we look at what it is we get to take home, it's who we are as people. You know, it's what it is we want. It's what we leave on this planet. Like, that's who we are. Cold water for me was a way of getting my breathing under control. It was a way of keeping me honest. I went into extreme conditions because in there's magic. There's that beautiful moment of who you are, because you can stay focused when everything else is chaos. You've got that moment. And extremes do that. And the ice did it for me. But when we talk about everything that we have, you know, we are all passengers in time. And a lot of times when I'm introduced by all of my achievements. But that's because of who I am. And I think everything needs to come back to who we are. Because who we are allows us to achieve. You know, I like to get up in the morning and think that I'm phenomenal. Many people might maybe question that. But I do. And sometimes when I drift into grey, I have to find it again. And the beauty of the ice is that it allows you to work on where you can find your weakness, you work on it. So some people, you know, find a weakness and they don't know how to deal with it. For me, I just get a pen and paper and let's make Nuala great again. You know, because being weak is a tough thing in a world. So just to finish off on a quote that my father would say is that no storm can hit you on four sides. You know, winds rotate. There's always somewhere to calm. There's somewhere to tuck in, and you let the storm pass. And anything that comes from the side or the stern will take your vessel, so always drive on. But for me, I suppose you have to follow what your mind pushes you to, and sometimes it's being a maverick, and sometimes it's not. But for me, the ice and the extremes and the remote locations of the world is where I found who I wanted to be. So thank you.
Nuala, that was absolutely brilliant. I'm not sure if Hugh is still online to
Sorry
say
about
anything
the
at
length of
end,
it now.
Absolutely wonderful.
Thank you.
Really, thank you for sharing
Not at all,
that
thank you.
with all of us. Are you happy to take
yeah.
questions? Yeah.
I'll sit down. If anybody has a question.
Thank you for a fantastic talk.
Thank you.
You remind me, and I looked up the Icelandic fisherman who fell in and was a long time in the water. And they took him to the lab and put a thermometer up his bum and concluded he was very efficient at conserving heat. They didn't report his heart rate. Interestingly, the case report was described by the British Medical Journal as an exceptional case, whereas New Scientist reported it as why the fat Icelandic fisherman survived his swim, which is, I thought, a little bit more down to earth. Have you been tested yourself? Do you slow your heart rate or anything?
You know, at the time, like the medical teams were always on top of us, so we were never allowed to go back into the water until everything was perfect for the swims. I've never really done anything on that level because, yeah, I suppose you would have to go to the UK and stuff like that. So no, it didn't bother me. The one thing that Dr. Arena had my medical testing for from 2011-12 until 2016, and she said there was a marked improvement in my cardiac, and the walls of the heart had strengthened or whatever, but you know, she was able to see the benefits. I will say that body fat is a big bonus, not in the reheating afterwards, but in definitely not losing the heat from the core. But yeah, you have to work really hard you really have to work hard on your blood pressure, and you have to work really hard on your cardiac as well. It's not a given.
I think you've probably got moral fibre as well. Congratulations.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Or we're just all overwhelmed with that extraordinary story.
Or tired.
So I've got any plans?
I've just set up the Nuala Moore Appreciation Foundation. So I'm going to applaud myself daily for who I am. Yeah.
How do we join?
Do you know what? Plans cost money. And I think one of the things that I spoke about there is that the cost of any event is the amount of your life you exchange for it. And COVID stopped everything. And suddenly you look back and you realize that, gosh, there's a lot of stuff to fix. So in 2019, I had hoped to go to Mount Everest to swim in 2020, to swim in a lake at 5,000 meters, because I wanted to see what the altitude looked like with the ice and see what the breathing would look like. I was due to go with the World Extreme Medicine at the time, but then COVID hit. So I'd love to go to the Antarctic. I'd love to, but, you know, maybe I'll invest in a hairbrush or something, you know.
Brilliant. Okay, Nuala, thank you. We've got a small token of
Thank
our
you so much.
appreciation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
You're very
Really,
welcome.
really
Thank you.
appreciate-
And thank you. And thank you for listening. Thank you very much.